Private Jennings heard the whisper before he saw the face. "Don't stare. Whatever you do, don't stare." He didn't understand until Staff Sergeant David Holloway stepped into the morning light, and Jennings felt his stomach lurch involuntarily. The left side of Holloway's face was a landscape of scar tissue, melted, ridged, the ear reduced to a small knot of flesh, the eye socket pulled downward in a permanent squint. The damage continued down his neck, disappearing beneath his collar, suggesting horrors that extended far beyond what was visible. Holloway's good eye swept the formation of 42 recruits. Several looked away. One woman in the back row made a small sound. Holloway's voice, when it came, was surprisingly soft. "I know what you're thinking. You're wondering what kind of monster the Army sent to train you." He let the word hang in the humid Georgia air. "By the end of this, you'll have your answer. If you believe true beauty is forged in fire, comment honor below." Staff Sergeant David Holloway had requested Fort Benning specifically. After 14 months of surgeries and skin grafts, after learning to speak again when the flames had damaged his throat, after the medical board tried 3 times to discharge him, he'd fought for the right to return to the one job he'd ever wanted, making soldiers. The Army, uncertain what to do with a drill instructor whose appearance might traumatize recruits, had hesitated. Holloway had been persuasive. "Fear is the first thing they need to overcome," he'd argued. "Let me be the lesson." So here he was, standing before Echo Company's newest cycle, watching them try not to look at the ruin of his face. He understood their revulsion. He'd felt it himself, those first months in the burn ward, when mirrors became enemies and even his own mother had struggled to hide her tears. But he'd learned something in that war, something about surfaces and depths. He intended to teach it. The nickname started within the first week. Holloway knew about it. Drill sergeants always knew. But he let it persist. Monster. The recruits whispered it in the barracks, used it as a warning when he approached. Monster's coming. They said it with fear, but also with a cruelty they didn't fully recognize in themselves. To them, Holloway was his face. Terrifying, inhuman, something to be endured rather than learned from. They didn't notice the way he memorized their names by day 2. They didn't register how he adjusted his corrections to each recruit's learning style. Harder on those who needed pushing, gentler with those already pushing themselves. They saw the scars. They saw the damaged eye that seemed to look through them. They saw a monster, and they treated him like one. Holloway absorbed it all without comment. He'd carried worse things than the contempt of children. The burns on his body were proof of that. The training intensified through weeks 2 and 3, and Holloway drove them relentlessly. 5-mile runs before dawn. Rifle drills until their arms shook. Land navigation through swamps that seemed designed to break spirits. Through it all, Holloway was there. Not screaming from the sidelines like other drill sergeants, but moving among them, his damaged face appearing suddenly beside struggling recruits. 3 more steps, he'd say quietly to a private ready to collapse. Just 3. Then 3 more. His methods confused them. He was terrifying to look at. His standards impossibly high, and yet his actual words carried none of the theatrical abuse they'd expected. When Private Jennings failed his first rifle qualification, Holloway didn't humiliate him. He sat beside him that evening, close enough that Jennings had to confront the scarred face directly, and walked through the mechanics of breathing and trigger pull until Jennings understood what he'd been doing wrong. "You'll pass tomorrow," Holloway said. It wasn't encouragement. It was fact. Jennings passed. The shift began with Private Coleman, a 19-year-old from Detroit who'd joined the Army to escape a neighborhood that had already claimed 2 of her brothers. She was tough, guarded, and she'd been one of the first to use the nickname. But during week 4, her grandmother died. The woman who'd raised her, who'd pushed her towards something better. Coleman received the Red Cross message and crumbled. She sat behind the barracks, trying to cry silently, failing. Holloway found her there. He didn't speak at first. He just sat down on the concrete beside her, close enough that she could see every ridge and valley of his scars in the fading light. "Tell me about her," he said. Coleman didn't know why she started talking, but she did. She talked for an hour, and Holloway listened without interruption. When she finished, he said, "She sounds like someone who understood that fire doesn't destroy everything. Sometimes it just burns away what doesn't matter and leaves what does." Coleman looked at his face then, really looked, and for the first time saw something other than damage. She saw someone who understood loss, who had survived unsurvivable things, who was still here. The story of how Holloway got his burns wasn't something he shared. But Corporal Martinez, an administrative assistant who'd served with Holloway in his previous unit, knew fragments. She told Coleman, who told Jennings, who told everyone else. Mosul, 2007. A convoy attack. An overturned Humvee with 3 soldiers trapped inside, fuel leaking, flames already licking at the chassis. Then Sergeant Holloway had been in the vehicle behind, far enough to escape unharmed. He didn't escape. He ran toward the fire. He pulled the first soldier out as the flames reached the fuel tank. He went back for the second while his uniform caught fire. He went back for the third while his skin began to melt. He was still trying to reach a 4th man, already dead from the initial blast, though Holloway couldn't have known when. The vehicle exploded and threw him 30 feet. 3 soldiers survived because of him. His face, his arm, his chest, his back, 40% of his body were the price. He'd received the Silver Star. He'd never mentioned it. The recruits sat in silence when the story finished circulating. That night, nobody used the nickname. Nobody ever used it again. The transformation was gradual, but undeniable. Recruits who had avoided Holloway's gaze began seeking it out. They wanted his attention now, wanted his quiet corrections, wanted to earn one of his rare nods of approval. They started to see what Coleman had seen that evening behind the barracks. A man whose exterior damage was the visible testament to an interior so committed to others that he'd walked into fire rather than let them burn alone. Holloway noticed the change but didn't acknowledge it. He simply continued his work, shaping them, pushing them, appearing at their elbows when they needed guidance and disappearing when they needed to struggle alone. He learned their stories the way he'd learned Coleman's. Jennings, whose father had told him he'd never amount to anything. Private Washington, who'd aged out of foster care with nowhere else to go. Private Okonkwo, whose immigrant parents had sacrificed everything for chances their son was determined to honor. Holloway collected these stories, held them, used them to understand what each recruit needed to become whole. Week 8 brought the final field exercise, a 72-hour crucible designed to test everything they'd learned. Rain fell for the first 40 hours straight, turning the Georgia woodland into a cold, miserable swamp. Recruits pushed through exhaustion, through blisters, through moments when quitting seemed like wisdom rather than weakness. Holloway moved among them throughout, somehow always present at the moments of greatest struggle. When Jennings's squad got turned around during night navigation, Holloway appeared from the darkness, not to rescue them, but to ask the right questions until Jennings found his own way back to the route. When Washington twisted her ankle at hour 50, Holloway helped her tape it, then watched her decide, on her own, to finish the course rather than accept evacuation. "Pain is information," he told her. "It's not a command." They finished the crucible at dawn on the 3rd day, every single recruit crossing the line. Holloway stood at the finish point, his scarred face wet with rain, and nodded once. In that nod was everything: pride, respect, acknowledgement of what they'd become. Graduation morning arrived crisp and golden. The recruits of Echo Company stood in formation, unrecognizable from the frightened civilians who'd arrived 10 weeks earlier. They were soldiers now, straight-backed, clear-eyed, transformed. When Staff Sergeant Holloway walked the line for his final inspection, there were no flinches, no averted gazes. Each recruit met his damaged eye directly, seeing the man rather than the scars. The ceremony proceeded with its traditional formalities: speeches, certificates, the symbolic transformation from recruit to soldier. But Echo Company had planned something additional. As the official program concluded, Private Coleman stepped forward carrying a wooden plaque. She marched to where Holloway stood and presented it with a crisp salute. Holloway looked down at the engraving. The words blurred, and he blinked hard, his good eye suddenly unreliable. The plaque read, "To our father, we see your heart, not your face. Echo Company, with gratitude beyond words." Holloway stood motionless for a long moment, the plaque in his hands, 42 soldiers watching him. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, the burns on his throat tightening with emotion he rarely permitted. "When I came here," he said, "you saw a monster. I don't blame you for that. I saw one too for a long time. The mirror showed me what fire does to skin, and I thought that was all I'd ever be. What the flames left behind." He paused, steadying himself. "But you taught me something these past 10 weeks. You taught me that fire also shows us who we are. It strips away everything false. What survives the burning is the only part that ever mattered." He looked at the plaque again, at the word father carved into wood. "I never had children. I thought the fire took that possibility along with everything else. I was wrong. I have 42 of them now, and I have never been prouder of anything in my life than I am of what you've become." He saluted them, a gesture that encompassed everything he couldn't say, and they returned it as one, a perfect synchronization of respect and love. Years passed, and the soldiers of Echo Company scattered across the world. They served in Afghanistan, in Syria, in places whose names would never make the news. Some rose to become officers, others finished their service and built civilian lives. But they stayed connected, bound by something stronger than shared experience. They called themselves Holloway's children, and every year on the anniversary of their graduation they sent him letters, photos, updates on their lives. Holloway kept everyone. He retired eventually, his body finally demanding rest, and he filled his small apartment with the evidence of lives he'd shaped. When he died peacefully at 71, they came from everywhere, 42 soldiers, now middle-aged, many with children of their own. They buried him with full military honors, and on his headstone, beneath his name and rank and the silver star he'd never discussed, they added the words he'd earned: father to many, monster to none.